I've got to give Mary his apologies. She's still in a meeting and she was hoping to make it, but she's not going to. Unless the meeting goes on extraordinarily long, yeah.
Thank you. We've also received apologies from Councillor Linda James and Peter Black. And if I could just do a quick roll call as well, please. Councillor Bridget Rowlands.
Present.
Councillor Chris Holly.
Present.
Councillor Des Thomas. Councillor Irene Mann. Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yes, yeah.
Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams.
Present.
Councillor Peter Jones.
Present, Emily.
And Councillor Philip Downing.
Present.
And the invited Cabinet members and officers today, Councillor Rob Stewart.
Present. And
Ben Smith.
Present.
And I believe today, perhaps joining us later on, we have Nick Parry observing the Swansea Council Communications and Marketing Officer. Chair, would you like me to move on to item 2?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. As the first meeting of this municipal year, we're required to confirm the convener, please. Councillor Chris Holly has confirmed he's happy to continue in this role. Could I ask the panel to indicate if they're also happy with that, please? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Second item on the agenda is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interest. Okay, none. Fourth item on the agenda is prohibition of whip votes and declarations of party whips. Okay, then the next item, item 5, is minutes of the previous meetings. I'll go through them. The first one on the 10th of May. Okay. Page 1, page 2, and page 3. Everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
I don't see anybody. Okay, right. Then item 6 is public questions, and I believe, Emily, we haven't got any.
No public questions today, no.
Okay, thank you. Item 7, overview, understanding financial reporting. I think this is for Ben.
It is indeed, Chair, and I'm going to canter through with a short primer. I'm going to share my screen in terms of some slides, as you asked me to give a bit of a primer, and then they will be made available to panel afterwards if they wish to see them. I'm sure they will. Can I ask if anyone can see anything yet?
No, not yet, Ben.
No, it didn't look like it was playing ball. Please bear with me. Well, that looks better. Something's happening, I think. It's my machine going a little bit slow.
Okay.
Hopefully you can see that.
Yes, I think I can see it. How about the rest of the members? Okay.
Let's see if I can make it any bigger.
Yep.
No, it's very good. I don't think you need to get it any bigger.
That
That's
might be
fine.
better if that's okay with members, because then I can see you as I'm speaking. So
Okay.
yes, as I indicated, to the chair, I'd give a bit of a primer before we go into the main report, and you'll hopefully forgive me my usual indulgence, and the images will be appropriately understood, I think, by the end. It won't be very long. I'm going to canter through. So for me, context is everything. You'll recall me coming over a number of years to this panel and others, and for the last 3 or 4 years, we've had quite a few years of overspending and some concerns around draws from reserves. But clearly last year we had a £17 million underspend, which was added to reserves, and Audit Wales undertook a financial resilience report which indicated that Welsh authorities as a whole added £23 million to reserves in 1920. We are all waiting with bated breath to see what they make of 2021. In terms of the stuff you're going to have in front of you today, and which will go to Cabinet next week, you will, if you've got your calculators out and work out all of the various pots of reserves, there's over £50 million potentially being added to reserves, which is clearly astonishing and exceptional levels of numbers, but it's also been an exceptional year. It's very early days because very few authorities have yet reported their outturn. We tend to be one of the faster ones, and this year we've pushed on and done it a whole cycle earlier. Normally we go in August, and we in July. We've managed to get to Cabinet for June, and hence why we've come here and squeezed this one in. I do expect, as I say, most Welsh local authorities to be reporting surpluses for 2021. A lot of the media attention is about what's going on in England, and you've seen a number of authorities in some difficulty and gaps in budgets and such like. It's fair to say the approach in Wales is different to England, and I think you will see the context in due course, but it's really difficult because what I'm giving you is our view without you really having a feel for what's happened across Wales as a whole. Even when I'm in happy, positive mood, it will not surprise you to know that I worry about the future. And I think all of you are aware that price inflation is building a bit in the wider economy. There is also potential pay inflation, notwithstanding the UK government's pay policy. It is unclear what our future funding is going to be, and last year was exceptional in terms of the levels of COVID support from the Welsh Government. There is ongoing COVID support in the current year, but thereafter, as a result of the spending review at the moment, there is no money provided for COVID support going forward. So anything that I say in terms of the snapshot also has to be thought of in terms of the longer term. And again, you know the kind of life cycle of things I'm dealing with. I refer to the long term as up to 50 years. We don't formally have financial documents that pretend to capture 50 years, but it's particularly important given the size and scale of the capital ambition and capital commitments that council in the past has previously committed to, and I'm certainly borrowing monies for up to that 50 years. The medium term, the 4 to 5 year outlook, is the medium term financial plan, and as you know, when that comes forward, there's an element of it which is for fun, in the sense that it's my best endeavours as to what are reasonable planning assumptions, but dreadfully difficult given most of our money comes from a finance settlement. And as the next line indicates, we tend to only get year to year grant settlements, something that the Public Accounts Committee has commented on very recently. We go into the council budget setting, which is for the year ahead, and that's the one that's really important. That's the one where my statutory duties fall upon me to ensure that you set a budget that is balanced for the year. We go through the year in terms of budget monitoring and forecasting, and it has to be said, there is always an element of pessimism bias in this. I mean, it's prudent to do so. If there are risks to spending, we tend to report them. If we're not certain we've got income, we tend not to count it until we've had the proverbial bird in the hand. And the problem in last year was an awful lot, as you've heard me say before, an awful lot of the grant offers were bids against pots of money through 21 other authorities. So not grants in the normal sense we're used to, of having certainty of a grant offer, which if we committed and delivered to that grant offer, we were guaranteed to get the money. And I think it's safe to say that all authorities were reporting that a lot of money was held back by the Welsh Government till relatively late in the day. They were being prudent and cautious, and then quite a lot of money came quite rapidly to all authorities at the end of the year. As I've already alluded to, there's the outturn report, which you've got sight of today, and it's going to Cabinet next week, and it has been a year-end dash for us. So I am pleased that my officers have managed to bring it forward a whole monthly cycle in what was probably the most challenging of years ever, given that COVID affected the whole lot. The statement of accounts will come in due course, and that's the much more formal document, the complex one, which is subject to full statutory audit. My obligation is to make sure the outturn and the statement of accounts are consistent with each other. The outturn is the one that's the understandable one. The statement of accounts is the one that's really complicated and no one really wants to read unless they want to have a good night's sleep. And the thing I must emphasise that these are always snapshots in a continuum, and as you're well aware, most of these all overlap on themselves each time that we're doing them. In terms of some of the primer bits, as you know, the format that I use for budget monitoring and outturn has been unchanged for a number of years, and effectively I refer to above and below the line items. The directorate and central corporate budgets are the above the line items, relatively simple and straightforward to understand. You then have the one in the middle, which is capital financing, which is inextricably linked to the capital programme, the capital outturn, the capital financing, and a whole raft of borrowing and lending decisions that I make in year. And that's the one that's probably the most difficult for people to understand. We then have the ones that start to go below the line in terms of reserves, draws to and from, and the financing side of the statement in terms of where it comes from, which is your block grant in NNDR, council tax, and the block grant. Put very, very simply, when you see the appendices, there's normally Appendix A in both the monitoring reports and the outturn report. It's a relatively simple one to remember. Minus is good unless it's bad, as the slide says. If it's a minus on the spend side above the line and in the central budget, underspend is good. If it's a minus on the reserve side, that's not good because it's a draw from reserves. And if it's a minus on the resource side, that's obviously not good because it's a shortfall in the funding side of the equation. The other thing to be aware of, and we have touched upon this a number of times, is that things can be in different places. And I'll give you two examples. In the last year, as you'll see in terms of the outturn, we suffered a very significant loss on council tax. We've posted a couple of losses on council tax below £1 million for the last 2 years. Last year, £2.5 million loss on council tax collection. There are concerns again nationally, including England and Wales and Scotland, over levels of council tax collection going forward. That is clearly shown in the outturn statement as a loss of resources, but we've been fully recompensed by it by the Welsh Government. We got a grant to fund that council tax loss, and that's shown in the corporate income items. So at first glance, it looks like we're down, but overall, we're ever so slightly up by about £100,000. And the other one, which is, that's an unusual one because it was being framed by the COVID context. The other one is a more normal one in the sense that we've done some of these property transactions before, and it particularly concerns around items where we're doing property purchases where we're expecting it to be financed by its rental stream. We are effectively servicing the borrowing costs in capital financing, and that will wash through in due course. But of course, the income flows to my colleagues in corporate property in the Place Directorate, which is income above the line. So you've got the capital financing below the line, the income going above the line. And for the small stuff, I don't really worry about the difference. But for the bigger items, eventually there needs to be a reckoning and a readjustment of budgets. And as well as on that one, them being in different places, they can be at totally different times, because typically there's a couple of years of build out before there are tenants in. So there's normally a time delay where I'm having to carry the difference. So whilst many of them are straightforward, you just have to be prepared. Some of them appear in funny places because they have to, because that's the rules. And the final slide for me, which I just wanted to touch upon, because I think this is the thing that's probably vexed panel the most. And you know I speak in metaphors, and it always used to be the cookie jars with the reserves. Well, I've gone for a different one, and deliberately so. And so, again, quite often, you know, you can have pictorial images where the bath is the reserves and you put money into reserves, then you pull the plug out and the reserves drain out. And for some of our earmarked reserves, that's relatively straightforward. And I think you all get that entirely. As I say, put the tap on, money flows in. When you need to draw from it, you pull the plug out for a bit, and then hopefully you put the plug back in, you turn the tap back on. The bath on a slope reference is where there are reserves that run over a number of years. And the most obvious one for us is contingency. I have a balance sheet contingency, which is clearly one-off. It's a store of water in the bath for want of something better. And we have a base revenue budgeted contingency. And that contingency sometimes is higher, sometimes lower. At the moment, it's lower than it's been in sort of 5-10 years ago, but there is a constant stream. Effectively, that tap is permanently on. There is money from that revenue contingency budget flowing into the reserve, and there is a pool of water stroke reserve money already available on the balance sheet, which can be very useful to call upon if there are things that are required. And the reason we have that, and what helps me, is with the general reserves, because as you're aware, I've advised you before, our general fund balances are relatively small for the size of authority, but we're able to run with relatively small levels of general reserves if we have very large numbers of earmarked reserves earmarked for a number of purposes. And then I have my one that just goes back to the slide at the very beginning, where I need you to imagine the bath on a seesaw on a slope. So you've got the same principle of restore of water, store of money, money going in, money going out. But council agreed several years ago to commit to an ambitious capital programme, which accepted that the revenue costs of capital financing would grow over time. So you've got the idea of the bath going uphill. But you also know that several years ago, council resolved to review its MRP policy, and we all know it's a zero-sum game over the lifetime. But in the very short term, we're saving money, and that is enabling me to feed that capital equalisation reserve. So what you have is a bath on an upward slope, but the seesaw down. So you can be pointing up and down at the same direction, but you know in the very long run, the MRP is going to unwind and that seesaw is going to slide up. So that's why you'll see very substantial sums in the short term flowing into that capital equalisation reserve, which looks very tempting and to dip into, but I am always using that as part of that long run. Go back to that very first slide where I said we don't formally have a 50-year plan, but I'm making borrowing decisions on council's behalf, which is financing for 50 years hence, and I'm considering the well-being of future generations. And so I'm trying to make that stretch. Panel will be aware from previous discussions it was always intended to stretch it to at least 25-26. During the budget round, with the acceleration announced by the UK government in the spending review of accelerated funding for the Swansea Bay City deal, I thought it probably stretched to about 28. We're still awaiting final detail in terms of the funding flows, because if I get City deal money faster, then I don't have to borrow it so fast. It might stretch out to about 28, 29. If I'm lucky, it might see us through to 2030. So it's important I made that sort of metaphorical reference to it to try and visualize it. I couldn't find enough clip art in time that was safe enough to put in the slides, so you'll have to sort of bear with my sort of written descriptor of the metaphor, but hopefully that gives you a bit of conceptual understanding as to why that one is particularly problematic for anyone to understand. And it's a reserve which is a snapshot in single time, but is looking back, looking forward, and looking many years forward for borrowing we haven't even yet done. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour of why we've got the context of what's to come, and hasn't treated you with disrespect in terms of, because I think you all understand the bulk of that, if not all of it, but I just wanted to re-emphasise some of those particular bits, and particularly those thorny ones. So that was the end of my presentation, Chair. I'm happy to pause if anyone wanted to ask any specific questions on that, but otherwise I'm happy to go straight on to the reports themselves, but I'll be guided by yourself.
Okay, can I ask, is there anybody who wants to ask any questions on that? And I have to say, Ben, it was very well put and very quite clear. Is there anyone who wants to ask any questions? No? Okay, well, thanks very much then. Okay, Ben, can you go on to the item 8 on the agenda, which is the revenue outturn, HRA, and the capital outturn and finance in 2021?
Yes, I will do. I'm just trying to, again, because it's defeating me in terms of not leaving the slides up. There we are. Apologies for the slight delay on that. Every time you turn into Teams, it changes where the buttons are. So, yeah, I think I'm going to start with the revenue outturn, obviously, and canter through it. I'm going to assume everyone's read it and just set some context and draw your attention to a couple of the main points. And I think that's where the bulk of the debate is going to be honest. And I alluded to it in the presentation. I mean, these are astounding levels of results, but they are exceptional for a number of reasons. And some of you have seen me here before with a grave look on my face, and I'm pretty darn happy with the results overall for the people of Swansea and the amount we've got, but I'm sure there will be some discussion and debate in due course. So section 1 of the report, as you're aware, sets out the overall contextual position. The first thing to draw your attention to is section 2, which is the detailed outturn position. You've got a summary table, and there is a reason why the very first line is outlined in bold. Services underspent by just over £20 million. You know, you've had before stories of some services overspending, some under. Across the board, they've all underspent. And the reason that's in bold, you'll be aware Cabinet received a report last month, even before we got to declaring outturn, that established the recovery fund at £20 million. I was so confident in my fellow members of CMT and my very able finance team that we were going to get £20 million in terms of service underspend, and why that early sign-off decision was given by me to enable Cabinet to make that decision to offer that back as an immediate dividend. So that's the reason that's in bold. And you've got a number of other items. I've referred to the contingency, which is in-year contingency. I do hold some central inflation plots. In recent years, I've not spent them. I think going forward, I'm much more likely to need to spend them, at least in the short term. We'll all have to see how the economy does and what happens overall. You've got the reference to one-off corporate costs and income. And that's an interesting one for the reasons I've said, where you've got that mismatch around council tax losses below the line, but income as one-off from Welsh Government for supporting us for the council tax losses above the line as extra income. There were also some very late offers of money from Welsh Government, effectively as referred to in the rest of that section, which says we were given money for two things: compensation for extra digital costs you had to incur to keep yourselves agile and flexible during the lockdown, and some compensation for failure to deliver all of your planned savings. Bear that one in mind, because I'll come back to that when I draw your attention to the summary appendix. We were compensated for both. Skipping on through, the next most important thing to draw your attention to is the table in 2.9.1. As I've alluded to, this was the most unusual of years, and my officers have adopted an approach of trying to summarise the sheer scale of flows of money that came in and out, both to us as a council, but also to us as agent for the Welsh Government in terms of the enormous support given to the business community in terms of rate reliefs and business grants. And I think it gives a really good snapshot of how overall generous the Welsh Government was in terms of compensating us. And I think the same will come in due course. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through the detail of the individual directorate comments. We'll answer questions on those in due course if needs be. The next important one to draw your attention to is section 4.4, which are schools reserves. Now, the tale I've given you in terms of late settlement of monies to the authority is equally true for schools. Panel is well aware from previous discussions that in absolute terms, our schools reserves are the highest in Wales. I would have thought they're guaranteed to be the highest in Wales as a result of a near trebling of them at outturn. This is again because of some late monies, and we do expect schools to significantly spend on that in the current year. Anecdotally, from a number of colleagues, they're in exactly the same position, including authorities that had schools in deficit positions, now in a place where they're likely to have surpluses declared at outturn, but an expectation they're going to have to spend on it. And again, the reason we keep that separate, the schools reserves are held by schools. So in the overall pantheon of things, you need to remember that that's not included in the Education Directorate line because it's already neutralised and schools hold those monies. Section 5 sets out my concerns, which I've summarised already in terms of some of the risks about going forward. And the future economic washout is the great unknown. I mean, a lot of our money, of a good chunk of our block grant comes from redistributed business rates. We've now had 2 years of offers of business rates holidays. There must be impact longer term on the national pool, and the Welsh Government is limited in its own tax raising powers and is heavily dependent on the Treasury. So we'll have to see what comes in due course. Section 6, as I'd already alluded to in year and reported previously, the tracker wasn't undertaken in year. Something had to give, and in the scheme of things, but you'll see with underspending across the piece, it almost didn't really matter. Section 7 pulls together the overall position. Again, I'm not going to read through the words, but you'll see the sheer number of reserves that are being added to as a whole, in terms of the recommendations I'll be taking forward to Cabinet next week. I will rapidly skip to Appendix A because that's where it's all boiled down on a page and it's probably the easiest one to see. And there are a few statements I wish to make to draw your attention to. As I indicated at the beginning, spend above the line, you're looking for a minus number on the variance is good news. And you take one look at that and everything apart from the additional savings line is minus lots of money, including education, social services. Typically, when things are reported, it's social care that's under the cosh. We have in the past in Swansea struggled to balance that education line. They have also underspent, and that's in addition to the £13 million has been added to schools reserves. The only item in that line that's got a positive is the additional savings. We didn't deliver the planned £194,000 worth of additional savings. But if we cast your mind back to what I said at the beginning, we got a late last minute grant to compensate us for savings that you might not have achieved. We got several £1 million for IT costs and savings not achieved. So it was a very generous, that was one of the items that we didn't have to bid for. It was given to authorities pro rata, which was a very generous settlement, which enabled me not to particularly worry about the £194,000. You go down to the next section of the table where you can see my centrally held pots of money, inflation, apprenticeship levy, minus, again, good news, the big lump on corporate items because of those block bits of grant we got in terms of the compensation I've already referred to. We get then down into capital financing costs, and as you are well aware from the last couple of years, and as I try to explain with my metaphor of the bath on a seesaw on a hill, in the very short run and for the foreseeable short medium term, there will continue to be significant underspends on that, because I have been deferring the financing of the capital programme by externalised borrowing. And right back at the beginning of the report, you could see reference to where I have been starting to undertake further externalised borrowing. All of those, again, as I say, minus, all very good news. You get to the earmarked reserves line. If you were all paying attention on the slide where I said everything is normally good if it's minus, it's not good if it's a minus on earmarked reserves, you'll be pleased to see that's a very big positive. So that is also good news. That's the money flowing into the metaphorical plenty of baths. Didn't spend all of our discretionary NNDR relief. So again, underspend, minus, it's the right way you want it to be. And then you get all the way down to the resourcing side. As you know, block grants are fixed, so you wouldn't expect a swing there. And then the last one, which is the bad news item, there's a minus item on council tax of 2,445,000. But as I've already indicated to you, above the line in those block extra surprise bonus grant income lines I got recompensed by about £2.5 million. So I'm even neutralised for that one in the year. And that's part of the reason for me having to try and contain my excitement, shall we say. That is a canter through of the important things that I needed to say. I didn't know if you wanted to invite the leader at this point, Chair, to say if there was anything contextually on top before officer questions are asked of me. You're still on mute, Chair.
Fine, thank you, Ben. Leader, do you wish to say anything?
Not at this stage, but I'm happy to take questions once the technical questions have been answered.
Okay. Right. Now then, let's go to members. Members, any of you want to ask any questions? Please put your hands up. Jeff Jones.
Yeah, it is good news. I must admit, when I was looking through the figures, you know, for some of the well, all the directorates really, but really social services. You know, Ben, you actually mentioned grants there. There seems to be an inordinate amount of positive grants, shall we say, that have actually shown these figures to turn out to be so positive. I'm a little bit worried, really, with regards to, I know they sent a lot of the money out, you know, very late in the day and so on. You know, what the next year will bring with regards to the Welsh Government. You know, how have they got such a shall we say, a large surplus to send this money out and so on? You know, whether perhaps I'm looking on the dark side, but it's been extremely positive this year. I wonder what the outlook, and have we got any feedback what the outlook is for next year?
I can come in immediately on that on a couple of bits. First, the bit that is that, again, because of the positivity for Swansea as a whole, we are controlling our own destiny on some of this, as well as the £20 million recovery fund I've already alluded to that came before Cabinet last month. The outturn report includes us putting aside another £5 million into social services reserves to protect social services locally against pressures they may have. In terms of the outlook, clearly last year was exceptional in terms of the amount of money that was announced by the UK government and the very substantial Barnett consequentials that flowed from it. The amounts announced to date are modest compared to that in the current year, undoubtedly so. And the Welsh Government's firepower is currently less. The amounts they've announced as coming to local government are currently less, but equally officials have opened dialogue with all 22 treasurers, asking us to set out what we envisage we might need for the whole of this year. No guarantees will be recompensed for it, but in terms of modelling a couple of scenarios, depending on how COVID goes, everyone recognises it's not over, that there are as much the economic consequences to come as the public health consequences. So I can't give you any certainty other than the quantum is much, much smaller. The quantum is likely to be bigger than what has already been announced. We did have the slight difficulty of there being the pre-election period, which did mean that ministers were limited as to what they could say for a period of time. So I do anticipate over the coming months there will probably be more announcements by the Welsh Government. And it's also the case that if the UK government announces any other measures in terms of support to the economy or public health on COVID measures, that there will be further Barnett consequentials. But you're right to be concerned that the amounts will be nowhere near as much. but equally there is likely to be further sums, and we have to some extent controlled some of our own destiny by prudently recommending setting aside sums that we can put some of Swansea's own taxpayers' money back on the table to protect services locally. I hope that helps, Councillor Jones.
Yeah, yes, it does actually. I can see, there's quite a lot of money that we're, shall we say, stashing away into the, the various reserves and so on. So really, with regards to if we get lower settlements actually in this year, really those reserves should really cover us for any shortfalls that we incur in the following year.
So in terms of settlement, I mean, settlement itself is done for the year. I think you mean settlement in terms of grant offers specifically. Yes, it will provide us with some protection. Clearly it will do so, but as I say, officials have indicated they do want treasurers to work closely with them, and that has probably been the biggest positive of the last year, where we've had the most frequent and open discussion and dialogue with officials and leaders, likewise with ministers, in terms of setting out what's needed and trying to find a reasonable balance. The one thing I would want this panel to take away, and equally Cabinet will next week, is I truly mean this as exception. I don't think you will probably ever see a treasurer rock up with a £50 million in totality across the lot add to reserves. If you do, great and good luck to them, but I suspect you probably won't. I think a fortunate combination of events locally applied by us, but also the relative generosity, and I think that will become clearer as all authorities start to declare their position, because it's something that hasn't yet been picked up by the media in terms of the reporting. It's very England centric. It's a fundamentally different funded model, both in terms of core services, council tax, retained business rates, and the approach that the devolved administrations have taken.
Okay, Peter Jones, Councillor Peter Jones.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My question, again for Ben, of course, is with reference to paragraph 5.4, his list of national uncertainties. Some of those one might regard as known unknowns, I suppose, using the well-known phrasing from the past. But at least one of them, and maybe more, is clearly an unknown unknown. And the one I'm referring to in particular is Brexit and Brexit uncertainty. I wonder, Ben, could you explain to us what you see as the areas of uncertainty and the potential scale of uncertainty under the Brexit heading?
I will endeavour to start, but I may hand over to others to comment as well. I mean, it really is, I think, one which is on the unknown scale in terms of things. Part of the current supply pressures which seem to be feeding into the economy. There must be a Brexit impact as a result of that. The levelling up agenda, the loss of EU funds, and the interesting discussion, shall we say, between the devolved administrations and the UK government. And I think the leader's worked out where I'll be handing over to him to further comment on that one. But clearly there are a number of matters that do concern me. I will defer to the leader because I don't think I really can put a figure on it at the moment. All authorities in Wales are currently making their bids through the various sustainable towns funds and the equivalent of what they're called, but it's probably appropriate that I ask to hand over to the leader on that at this point, if I may.
Thank you.
Okay, leader.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. But very happy to come in on this point. I mean, I think Councillor Jones is absolutely right, to point out that there are some pressures coming down that we don't yet know the totality of. Certainly, we're starting to see across the construction sector, for instance, in Swansea, significant issues with both availability of labour and obviously in terms of supplies of raw materials. And that's thankfully, we're still on track with our major schemes, but I know private schemes and others are starting to see the pension. I think that's inevitable because, of course, there's been almost a fake position for some time now due to the pandemic, where the true impacts of the new Brexit arrangements haven't fully been seen. And I did quite look at amazement of the owner of Wetherspoons bemoaning the fact that he can't get staff when he was a major advocate for stopping members from other European states coming to the UK to work. So he's reaping the rewards of his own undoing there, really. And as you know, I'm very sad at the outcome of the Brexit vote, and I fully expect things to become more difficult in the coming months as the economy opens up and as people finally see some of the inadequacies of the current arrangements. We are doing our best to navigate that, and I think our officers and our partners who are helping deliver Copper Bay and the other big major schemes in the city are doing an excellent job to make sure that we continue to remain on track with the delivery of those schemes. But inevitably, everybody is starting to see some of the pressures of the Brexit arrangements coming through. That will obviously follow through in due course to higher prices, and Mr. Smith has mentioned inflationary pressures that we may see in the coming months and years, and clearly that is already starting to be seen as part of the price increases coming from the new arrangements from Brexit. So that is there. If I may, Chair, as well, just to add to what Mr. Smith said around the overall financial position, yes, we are in a very unique position this year, and you will have heard us say in previous sessions that our budget's flexed by over £100 million during the last year. I know there was talk yesterday or the day before at the audit committee around the use of agency staff, and I just remind members that we have taken actions during the year to try and maintain and increase our workforce temporarily to deal with the extra resources that were required to get us through the pandemic, and that will obviously have meant the use of more temporary staff in some of those areas. So again, the position of this administration is to reduce the amount of agency workers that we use, but obviously we are not going to leave services without the necessary resources, especially in a pandemic situation, and that does need to be acknowledged. We are not out of the pandemic yet, and we are still in very, very unique waters. But I am very pleased with the financial position we're in. We've put aside, as Mr. Smith has said, some specific reserves to help us where we think pressures may arise. And again, just to reassure members of this committee, because I know there have been members that are being concerned about our ability to repay some of our borrowing, as Mr. Smith has said, we're in a very healthy position at the moment, whereby through the bolstering of the capital equalisation reserve, we can not only make sure that we have no call on council tax to repay our borrowing for the next 5 years, but actually for the next potentially 2 terms of not just the next council, but the council after that. And that is very much the position I had indicated I wanted us to be in at the start of this, which is we would deliver the big improvements that people had sought in the city, but also we would do so in a way that didn't mean a direct call on council tax. In terms of levelling up, because obviously that is really important, as is the Shared Prosperity Fund going forward, you will have heard me say at the Select Committee and elsewhere recently that the levels currently available are simply insufficient. In terms of the levelling up fund this year for Wales, it's about £40 million. I'd remind members, if you look at our capital programme, we're spending more than that on our schools just in Swansea, and our capital programme is the biggest it has ever been at £204 million. And I think, having looked back at previous years, that's about 3 years of spending in say, if you looked at perhaps a decade ago, that would have been the equivalent of 3 years of spend on the capital programme. So it's large by anybody's measure, but also it shows the scale that's required from the UK government in terms of making sure they make good on their levelling up promise. I'm obviously discussing with UK government ministers the need for a greater quantum, because the last thing I want is local authorities in Wales fighting over a very small prize. We need to be, if the rhetoric's to be believed in terms of levelling up, then the quantum of the levelling up funds, the Shared Prosperity Fund, does need to be significantly higher than it is currently. So, I am hopeful that 1.5 billion per annum that's been mooted will be seen in coming years, and I hope that Swansea will certainly be fighting for a large slice of that pie. I think the one thing that does worry me about the Shared Prosperity Fund, overall other things outside of quantum, is the fact that it becomes a competitive process. And again, we do need to ensure that money goes to where it's needed, not just where the sexiest bid comes from, because that has always been one of the things that I think the European Union funds did help to achieve, was that putting the money where the need was greatest. So it's a new process. We're going to make sure that we bid in that process, that we play in that process, but the process has to be fair and it has to be transparent, and it has to be able to deliver for areas like Swansea. So thank you, Chair. I mean, it's It's just I'm really pleased with where we are, but there are some real risks ahead.
Thank you very much. Any other members want to say anything? No? No, well,
Sorry, Chris. Can I, with Ben, really just go back to the, capital financing charges, and the MRP. I must admit, if I can call them savings on what we actually paid before, seem to be a lot larger than, shall we say, I envisaged and so on. It would mean really, I know you're actually talking about a state of tip, shall we say, or where it actually tips, so 29, 30 and so on. But because we've actually paid a lot less now, surely we'd be paying a lot more when the tipping process actually goes to shall we say, a negative. Did we anticipate that sort of saving on the MRP originally?
The MRP one is relatively straightforward and only drives a very small proportion of it. That's the bit that is the seesaw in my metaphor, and we have fully factored that in. I mean, when council made the decision, I deliberately set out the whole funding all the way through for the next 100 years to the point it was fully recompensed. And so that pivot part is fully provided for to the life of the MTFP, but will continue beyond that. The big drivers are more than that. When we come on very briefly to the other reports, as you'll see in the capital outturn, notwithstanding the very substantial scale of the outturn spend, as the leader has alluded to over £200 million, there's still 40 odd million pounds worth of slippage that will be spent in due course. That's 40-50 million quid I haven't had to finance yet, and that saves me a couple of £1 million off the top of my head just on the revenue financing of the costs alone. And equally, as I've alluded to at the beginning of the report, I made reference to I deliberately haven't externalised a large amount of debt. Council did agree £180 million borrowing envelope, which this time round was increased to £200 million. And you'll be aware that I'd only formally reported that I'd exercised the £90 million before that premium came in. The report references that I did undertake a very substantial tranche of borrowing in April, and I will also be updating Cabinet when I present the report to them, indicating I took out another substantial tranche of the borrowing in May. So I borrowed 90 of the original 180 million, going to 200 million. I've now borrowed two further substantial sums, of which one is another 45 million pounds alone. So the saving on the quantum of the capital slippage and the saving on deferring and kicking down the road by only a couple of months. This isn't particularly clever financial engineering where it comes and bites you on the proverbial derriere a few years later on. This is pretty sensible stuff where I'm locking in, and as the report alludes to, with the 45 million pounds at the lowest ever PWLB rates, well, the ones I did in May were at the even lowest lower PWLB rates. So I'm at a position where I've locked in the majority of the spend apart from for Band B schools, because that comes later, and the additional stretch £20 million envelope that was agreed as part of the budget setting by council. And that's one of the bits of interplay, because one of the things that gives me safety and security is, as you know, my strategy unashamedly is to borrow very, very long and very, very low. I'm only interested in 46 to 50 year money, and I'm interested when it's below 2%. All of that is helping bring down that loan pool rate, which you've heard about before. My predecessors were paying MRP at 4% and interest at 6%. We will get the pool interest rate down, I believe, when I report to council in the mid-year report, that will be below 4%. To have done that in a couple of years by taking advantage of the rates is really, really useful. And of course, it's locked in for the whole 46 to 50 years. So those are the things that predominantly drive it. And you'll be aware in both the revenue budgets and the MTFP, I have built in that escalator effect, because the capital financing budgets will need to increase. And that goes back to what I tried to say at the beginning in terms of whatever snapshot we take for the year for the budget, which has to be balanced for the MTFP, I'm also mindful of a number of years beyond that, not really out in the really long term. You know, the really long term is only really worried about the 50-year borrowing horizon, but it's that bit in between which the leader alluded to, and I did too, that in terms of I was expecting peak borrowing about 25, 26. With the city deal arrangements, I was expecting it to stretch to 28, 29, and it may stretch all the way through to 2030. So it's a combination of factors, of which that seesaw effect on MRP is only part of it. And yes, rest assured, Councillor Jones, all of the schedule that was set out in the council decision to approve it is factored in entirely in the MTFP, and as future years roll forward and the MTFP is added to, as it moves along that trajectory, they will be added in. So I am entirely comfortable that it is all factored in, but I also know that in that shorter part of the medium term, you can expect some additional underspending on capital financing in year, which will be able to be added to the capital equalisation reserve, which in itself helps stretch it out to that longer time frame. And here we are, as I say, I mean, for me, the city deal stuff, as you recall, there was quite a debate in council in early March where we did the 3 announcements in the wrong order, didn't we, between UK government, Welsh government and ourselves, where there was an announcement it was going to be accelerated. I've still got no greater certainty as to what that's going to be accelerated to in terms of specific amounts. We all were told the time horizon, but clearly all of that helps. So there are still some unknowns. It goes back to Councillor Peter Jones' point, which is there are unknown unknowns, but some of them are slightly more known than other unknowns, if you know what I mean. So it is the one that's most undoubtedly complicated, and it's one that's difficult for me in any snapshot of a quarterly monitoring report or an in-year report or even in budget setting alone to give you the flavour of the overall bit, and hence that back to that metaphor of, you know, all 3 of the bits of the bath on the slope, but also on a seesaw. So it can be pointing down when it's pointing up, and will eventually reverse, and there will be a pointing upness, but that is fully factored into my planning assumptions over the longer term, medium term, and fully factored into the MTFP.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, can I say in closing, really, a lot of the people have already asked the questions I was going to ask, Ben. I've been in this game now about 30 odd years. I've never seen a budget report like this. I've never, ever seen a treasurer come forward with so much money in the way this has. I've never seen a treasurer turn around and move money into reserves in the levels that we've moved it into. And I'm quite taken aback by how much it is. You know, when you consider that, you know, we also have put in savings in our budgets, and yet we are putting so much money into reserves. So it is an astonishing budget. It's just astonishing fact that, you know, that we have had all this money given to us by the Welsh government, and yet I see that even in social services, you know, the director's comments about having significant impact on the income and expenditure of the directorate. You know, you would expect the social services that during COVID-19 to have, you know, spent all the huge amount of money, but you know, it's there in black and white to say. So as I say, it's an astonishing paper, and I've read it about 3 times, and I was hoping I could catch you out on something, but I can't, because you just got so much money. You must be, you know, really pleased about it. And well, all I can say is that I've read, you know, what Councillor Peter Jones said about Section 5 on the ongoing implications of the budget. Even if you had a crystal ball, I don't think you would be able to predict what the outcome, what's going to happen in the future. I just don't understand if there's a 3rd wave, if there's another mini lockdown, or if the UK government in its spending review in a couple of months' time turns around and says there's going to be no more quantum increase for, you know, Scotland or Wales, and you know, you'll have that figure set for the next 3 years. You know, you just don't know, and I think what you've listed there in paragraph 5, I think, is a flavour of what's likely to come, and not, you know, not predictable, you know. So all I'll say is that, you know, you must be like Midas with everything you've touched has turned to gold. It's amazing, an amazing budget outturn. So, you know, all I can say is that when, you know, we will say to Cabinet, you know, you've got all this money, spend it wisely.
If I may come back in
Yeah.
Chair. Thank you for that, and I think you're right. I mean, the forward look is going to be really, really difficult. You've only got to think about what I've come and said in year, both to Cabinet and to yourself. Right at the beginning of the year, we were in the midst of the biggest black swan moment in 100 years, and we were spending tens of millions of pounds assisting the NHS in terms of building the field hospital, spending money left, right, and centre before we had any certainty of the sums back. So I was anticipating we might need to draw from reserves. I think you will see a very similar pattern across all authorities in Wales come the outturn, and so context is going to be important. I think you are right. There are concerns going forward, which I've alluded to. And it remains even more uncertain. That, you know, the comprehensive spending review wasn't a comprehensive spending review. It became a one-year settlement. We are all faced with still one-year settlements. We've all touched upon there are some uncertainties over Brexit. It's the pressures building in terms of supply and price chain, but undoubtedly so. And one of the other things which I think you're right in terms of the size of it, it's almost as a treasurer, it's great to have the money. It's like, is it almost too much? Because a lot of these were competitive bids against 21 other authorities, and I've yet to. I would be surprised. I might be proven wrong. I'd be surprised if anyone else in Wales outturns at 50 million as a collective for the year. Some of these were competitive bids, and perhaps we were particularly good. It's at risk of blowing our own trumpet, but perhaps we were particularly good at some of those competitive bids and influencing what we thought was right and proper for the citizens of Swansea. Because at the end of the day, whilst I've been honoured to be able to influence some of the decisions where small groups of treasurers have worked on things, and we've worked in a genuinely collaborative approach, it will come as no surprise that I discharged my statutory duty, which was to put the interests of Swansea residents first. That's my day job as the Section 151 officer. So I thank you for your comments, and I think you're right to make the points you've made, Chair. I'm conscious that's probably all that I need to say on the revenue out, and there were two other reports also on the agenda, and if we have concluded on this, you'll be pleased now I can do both of them relatively quickly. But
I think the capital one, if we can do the capital one next,
yes,
and then HRA one after that, because the HRA one, really, in all honesty, having gone through it, there's very little anybody can say about that, other than the fact that 900,000 seems to be a very small amount. But on the I've got a question, and I think an explanation required on the capital one. But if you could do the capital one.
Again, recognising the time, and it is a Friday, I'm not going to overly stretch the time, but the points I wanted to make formally on the record, as the leader has already alluded to, I mean, this is a capital outturn at over £200 million, biggest ever. I do keep an eye on other authorities, and two others have declared their overall position today, and I won't name them because but I noted that our slippage was more than one of the two of them's entire capital programme. It sort of fits in with the reference the leader has made to the scale of it, and as I've already touched upon, you know, the slippage, I always rub my hands weekly every time I come here, don't I? And I always go, yeah, there's some slippage. It's the thing that drives the leader rather more nuts than me, because it means there has been some slippage. But in the context of a COVID environment where we were stayed open and delivered over £200 million, a bit of slippage can be tolerated. But from my point of view, that's money I don't need to spend yet, and it helps feed into both the HRA and the general fund position. So I have nothing particularly that I need to draw to attention other than the sheer scale of it and how we've financed it. And I'm happy to take questions, but again, I didn't know if there's anything the leader wanted to add to the report, because again, it's an astonishing report. You've had the first one, which is a ginormous amount of revenue bolstering, but this is at the same juxtaposition as the largest ever capital programme, and we've carried on in spite of, and again on a scale probably not matched by any, it can't be matched by any other authority in the year.
Leader.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to add to what Mr. Smith said, really, I think just to remind members that we do have the largest capital programme ever. It was increased during the year from what we had planned. We also then went out and built a hospital for the health board. We also, of course, had to deal with several lockdowns during the year, which obviously disrupted our ability to deliver some of those programmes. So overall, I am still incredibly proud of what has been achieved in this year, given the headwinds that we were facing, given the uncertainty that we were facing. because of course every time we get into a position where we're having to lock down again, that's uncertainty about what's allowed, what isn't. You know, you do get into a bit of a stop-start. So especially when the pandemic hit, first of all, there was obviously disruption, but to have still delivered the sort of capital program that we've got, I mean, again, you know, with the numbers of live school bills that are currently underway, the housing improvements and bills that were underway, as well as the big major projects, it is absolutely fantastic effort, and I want to pay tribute to all the staff that have made and the contractors that have made that possible. It's an outstanding effort.
Okay. Any questions from any members? Thank you. Ben, I wonder if you could go to page 3, the very top of page 3. It says finance in 2020, 2021. You've got supported borrowing, obviously, unsupported borrowing, plus HRA, but you have got the revenue contributions to capital of 33 million. Can you explain to members what that is?
Yes, so under our powers, we are able, it's the one-way valve, isn't it? We can't spend capital on revenue, but we can spend any amount of revenue on capital. And in terms of our overall capital programme, a very substantial part of the HRA business plan and the HRA funding presupposes that we are making large revenue contributions to the capital programme. That's where the bulk of it comes from. And I am able to apply any revenue reserve to finance capital. Authorities that have got themselves into difficulty have had to rely on the capitalisation directions, which is the thing that turns it the other way around. We've had a long-standing strategy of very substantial revenue contributions to capital, and predominantly in the HRA. There are some others that we have done, and as we draw sums from that capital equalisation reserve, that is a revenue-backed reserve, so they themselves would also score as revenue financing to capital.
That's the reason I asked the question, because HRA is a separate entity and it didn't have it alongside it. So, you know, and I know that capital utilization is revenue that would be feeding into the capital, into the revenue that would pay off the bill of the interest and the capital. But because it said it that way, I wasn't sure what that was.
Yes, and so we treat the capital programme as a whole. So it's on this one that both the HRA and general fund are in as one, because at the end of the day, all of the financing is pooled. But when it comes to revenue contributions, only HRA revenue can fund HRA capital, and vice versa. So apologies for that not being clearer in the report.
Yeah, because at the top, unsupported borrowing, general fund plus the HRA. So, you know, that figure then becomes 94 million. You know, so that's the figure that we are actually got of unsupported borrowing, if in the description that you've given.
Yeah, yes, and equally, whilst you were talking, Chair, I was just equally checking in the following report on the HRA. So you've referred to the 33 million of revenue contributions. I can see in the HRA report, when we come on briefly to touch upon that, 29 million of that, yes, 33 is the HRA contribution.
So there's 4 million going into the into the general fund then.
Yes, and there are some items that are funded that way, and that, as I say, includes where I'm happy to draw.
No, I think it's important that people realise that, because it's not a separate capital fund that we are putting revenue into. It's the one capital fund. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Is there any? I don't think there's anyone else. Anybody? Okay, right. Well, thank you very much. Ben, can we go on to the HRA? I will be extremely brief. As you've already alluded to, Chair, it's relatively straightforward. It's relatively modest in terms of the variations. The section 1.2 sets out the overall position, which is a modest underspend. Again, most services were able to be kept running. We did increase the amount of revenue contributions to capital outlay by £3 million. There were some reductions in repair costs. The focus was on essential immediate repairs, because we were in lockdown, otherwise faced with having to go into people's houses. So prioritisation was done for essential repairs. And you've already heard in terms of some of the arrangements I've done on the capital financing. The loans pool is pooled, and the HRA benefits from any of the jiggery-pokery we manage on saving on capital financing as a whole. So that's why it's saved there. And the other pleasing thing is the amount we'd set aside quite a sizable chunk for bad debts, because we were worried that bad debts
could start to rise as people found themselves in difficulty economically. That hasn't happened in the current year, which is the pleasing part, but I think it feeds into some of our wider discussions and concerns about what economic scarring may come in future. So it's good news for the current year, but it is an item that I know the relevant cabinet member and my colleagues in housing are acutely aware of. They've been very proactive in working with tenants, but clearly if there is substantial economic scarring still to flow through as a result of COVID and societal lockdown, then that may become more problematical in the future. But overall, the HRO is very much like I normally say to Cabinet and Council, which is tidy year, looked after itself, modest addition to reserves, nothing really to see here, particularly unless anyone had any questions.
All right, as I say, it's only 900,000 to reserve, and that was about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Any members wish to ask any questions? Leader, do you wish to make any comments?
No, all I was going to do, Chair, with your indulgence, because seeing as we've covered all the reports, is just to put on record again my thanks to Mr. Smith and his team for all the work they've done, because people will remember it's not just been making sure that we get to this really healthy position and being one of the first councils to report that position, but also Mr. Smith's team has been there making sure that we get the payments out to businesses and doing all the extra stuff that they had to do to support the wider economy during the pandemic. And again, you know, many of the systems that are being employed in Wales to support the economy, the wider economy, private sector, have been ones that have been developed and designed here in Swansea and then applied elsewhere. So, you know, I think we should be really grateful for what Mr. Smith and his team have done this year again.
He's the master magician.
I should have brought my Harry Potter cloak, shouldn't I?
Yeah, I should have, definitely. A cloak of invisibility, I think you should have. Okay. Anyone else? Any comments? If not, can I, on behalf of the committee, thank the panel. Thank you very much for this afternoon and the very timely way that you and the department and all the people that are feed into your department have actually put together this budget. And thank you very much for being here and explaining it so well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ta-ra, and thank you, Leader. The next item on the agenda is item 9, which is the draft work plan. The only thing I want to point out here is the fact that there is a possibility when we come to the planning, the planning annual performance report in November, it could be a bit more in depth than what we normally do, because there are some issues that as a scrutiny board we may need to be looking at. But when I get the more information on that, I'll be sending it out to members. In the meantime, August, you have the Richard Rowlands' report, and I think I'm right in saying this is not going to be very substantial, is it, Emily?
No, we'll wait and see what comes with that, Chair.
It is. It could be very little, but on top of that, we have got the local government use of data action plan, and there will probably be added to that then an update on a couple of the other issues around economic development and the recovery plan. And I think that's it. Has any member got any questions or comments about the work plan? No? Okay, and for information are the letters that we have, or the one letter that we've sent out. Is that okay? If there's no other business and no other comments, I would wish you all a happy weekend and stay dry.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Emily, can you stay on for a minute?